The fire came first, not the pain. Ivy felt the heat crawl across her skin before she understood what was happening, and by the time she opened her mouth to scream, her stepmother was already standing over her with both hands raised, her eyes glowing a sickly shade of green that Ivy had never seen before. "You should have stayed quiet," Margaret said, her voice calm, almost gentle, as if she were scolding a child for spilling milk instead of tearing apart a young woman's entire future. "But you just had to remind your father who you look like." Ivy tried to speak, but her throat had gone dry, and her skin felt like it was being pulled from the inside. She looked down at her hands and watched, in horror, as the smooth skin she had always known began to ripple and change, turning rough and gray, thickening in places it should never thicken. She screamed then, finally, but the sound that came out did not sound like her own voice. "Stop," she begged. "Please, stop." Margaret did not stop. She stood in the center of the candlelit room, her silk robe pooling around her feet, and watched with something close to satisfaction as the curse took hold. This was not a spell she had learned recently. She had been practicing it for years, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the day Ivy turned 18 and became, in the eyes of the kingdom, a woman old enough to inherit her mother's title and her mother's lands. Ivy's mother had been beautiful. Everyone said so. The portraits in the East Hall of Ivy's family home still showed her laughing in a garden of white roses, her hair the color of wheat in summer, her eyes the clearest blue anyone in the province had ever seen. When Ivy turned 16, people had begun to whisper that she looked just like her, and that whisper had been the beginning of everything that went wrong. Margaret had married Ivy's father 2 years after her mother's death, arriving in a caravan of trunks and silk dresses, smiling sweetly at everyone who greeted her at the gates. She was beautiful too, in a sharp, glittering way, the kind of beauty that made people compliment her, and then feel slightly uneasy afterward, though none of them could ever say why. She had a way of looking at Ivy that made the girl's skin crawl even before any of this began, a look that lingered a second too long, that seemed to measure and weigh and resent. Ivy's father, Edmund, had never noticed. He was a kind man, but a weak one, the sort of man who avoided conflict the way other men avoided open flame. He had let his new wife run the household exactly as she pleased, had let her dismiss the old servants who had loved Ivy's mother, had let her slowly push Ivy further and further to the edges of her own home, and he had told himself, each time, that it was simply the way new families adjusted to each other. He was not in the room when the curse happened. He was 3 floors below, asleep in his study, with an empty glass of wine on the table beside him, and he would not wake until morning, when it would already be far too late to undo what his wife had done. The pain lasted only a few minutes, though to Ivy it felt like hours. When it finally stopped, she collapsed onto the stone floor, gasping, her whole body trembling. She could feel that something had changed. Her face felt heavier, wrong, unfamiliar beneath her own fingers. She reached up slowly and touched her cheek, and what she felt made her stomach turn. "There," Margaret said softly, crouching down beside her, her green eyes fading back to their usual pale gray. "Now you understand. Beauty was never something you deserved to keep, little Ivy. It belonged to your mother, and now it belongs to no one." Ivy could not answer. She could barely breathe. Margaret stood, smoothing her robe, and looked down at the shaking girl on the floor, with an expression of quiet triumph. "You will tell no one what happened here tonight," she said. "You will tell them you fell ill, a fever perhaps, that scarred your skin. If you try to explain what really happened, if you try to tell your father the truth, I promise you the curse will grow worse, and I will make certain no healer in this kingdom will ever be able to touch it. Do you understand me?" Ivy managed a small, broken nod. "Good girl." Margaret turned and walked toward the door, pausing only once to glance back over her shoulder. "You should be thanking me, you know. Out there, beyond these walls, beauty gets women killed just as often as it gets them crowned. I am doing you a favor." The door closed behind her, and Ivy was left alone in the dark, staring down at hands that no longer felt like her own. She did not sleep that night. She sat curled against the cold stone wall of her chamber until dawn began to creep through the narrow window, and only then did she force herself to stand and walk to the small mirror above her wash basin. She almost did not recognize the face that stared back at her. Her once smooth skin was now marked with rough, uneven patches, gray and cracked in places like dried earth after a long drought. One of her eyes sat slightly lower than the other. Her once graceful nose had thickened and bent. Her lips, once soft and full, were now cracked and pale. She looked like something out of an old story meant to frighten children, and for a long moment she simply stood there, unable to look away, unable to cry, unable to feel anything at all except a hollow, spreading numbness. Then, slowly, the numbness gave way to something else. Anger, a quiet, burning anger that settled deep in her chest and did not leave. She thought of running straight to her father's study, of shaking him awake and telling him everything, showing him her face and demanding he do something, anything, to fix what had been done to her. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she remembered Margaret's warning, and worse, she remembered every single time in the past 2 years that her father had looked away from something he did not want to see. He would not believe her. Or worse, he would believe her and still do nothing, because doing something would mean standing against the woman who now controlled every corner of his life. Ivy made her decision before the sun had fully risen. She would not stay in this house and wait for her stepmother to finish whatever cruel plan came next. She would not give Margaret the satisfaction of watching her wither away in shame behind these walls. She packed a small bag with what little money she had saved from selling her mother's old jewelry over the years, a habit she had begun the moment she noticed Margaret eyeing the pieces with too much interest. She took a warm cloak, a few pieces of bread from the kitchen, and, most importantly, she took the long gray veil that had belonged to her mother, the one she used to wear during the cold winter months, when riding through the northern hills. She fastened the veil over her ruined face with trembling hands, checked that no one was in the hallway, and slipped out through the servants' entrance just as the first light of morning touched the courtyard. The guards at the gate barely glanced at her. A veiled woman leaving early in the morning was nothing unusual in a household with as many strange habits as this one had developed under its new mistress. Ivy walked through the gate and did not look back, not even once, though part of her wanted desperately to see her childhood home one last time. She walked for hours, following the main road south, away from the province where everyone knew her family's name. Her legs ached, her stomach growled, and beneath the veil, her ruined face throbbed with a dull, constant pain that no amount of walking seemed to ease. But she kept moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering the way Margaret's eyes had glowed green in the candlelight, and remembering that was worse than any physical pain she was currently enduring. By midday, she reached a small crossroads marked by a weathered wooden signpost. One arm pointed toward the capital, where her father's name still carried weight, and where someone might recognize her, veiled or not. The other arm pointed toward the border territories, a wilder stretch of land, known for its dense forests, its scattered villages, and its notorious lack of any real law beyond the occasional patrol of the northern packs, the shape-shifting warriors, who guarded the kingdom's edges and answered to no one but their own Alpha King. Ivy chose the border road. It was not a decision made lightly. She had heard stories about the border territories her whole life, stories meant to frighten children into obedience, tales of wolves who walked as men, and men who turned into wolves beneath the full moon, of a king so powerful and so untouchable that even the royal court in the capital treated him with careful respect rather than command. But those same stories told her something else, something that mattered far more in this moment. They told her that the border territories were a place where no one asked too many questions, where a woman with a veil and a false name could disappear into the crowd and never be found by anyone looking for her. She walked until her feet blistered and her legs shook, and just as the sun began to dip low behind the hills, she saw the first sign of a village ahead, a cluster of small wooden buildings with smoke curling from their chimneys, arranged loosely around a central well. It was nothing like the grand estate she had grown up in, nothing like the polished stone halls and manicured gardens of her childhood, but in that moment, exhausted and afraid and utterly alone, it looked like the safest place she had ever seen. She approached slowly, keeping her veil pulled low, and found a small inn near the edge of the village with a faded wooden sign that read simply, "Rooms and Bread." An older woman stood behind the counter, sorting through a stack of coins, and looked up when the door creaked open. "Evening," the woman said, her voice rough but not unkind. "You look like you've walked half the province." "Nearly," Ivy admitted, keeping her voice steady despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her. I need a room, if you have one to spare. I can pay. The woman studied her for a long moment, her eyes lingering on the veil but asking no questions about it. In the border territories, she had learned long ago, everyone carried something they preferred not to explain, and prying rarely earned anything but trouble. Got one room left, small but warm, the woman said, sliding a key across the counter. Name's Greta, if you need anything. Kitchen closes soon, but I can bring you up some bread and broth if you're hungry. Thank you, Ivy said, and for the first time since the previous night, she felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not safety, not yet, but the first faint possibility of it. My name is Ivy. Well, Ivy, Greta said, already turning back to her coins. Welcome to Thornwick. Not much happens here, which most folks find is exactly the point. Ivy carried her small bag up a narrow staircase and into a room barely large enough for a bed, a wash basin, and a single wooden chair, but it had a door that locked, and after the night she had just survived, that was more than enough. She sat on the edge of the thin mattress, finally allowing herself to remove the veil now that she was alone, and stared down at her hands in the dim candlelight. She did not know in that moment what her life was going to become. She did not know that she would spend the next several months building an entirely new identity in this small border village, learning the healing arts from a reclusive old woman who lived at the edge of the forest, or that word of a skilled but mysterious veiled healer would eventually spread far beyond Thornwick's borders. She did not know that fate, in the strange and often cruel way it worked, was already setting in motion a chain of events that would one day bring the most powerful man in the entire kingdom to her doorstep, wounded and desperate and utterly unaware of who he was truly meeting. All she knew, sitting alone in that small rented room with her ruined face finally free of its veil, was that she was alive, she was free of her stepmother's roof, and she had absolutely nothing left to lose. She thought of her father, asleep in his study, unaware that his daughter had vanished into the night. She thought of Margaret, likely already crafting a story to explain her stepdaughter's sudden absence, something involving illness or a hasty arranged marriage to some distant relative, anything that would keep the household from asking too many questions. She thought of her mother's portrait in the East Hall, that laughing woman in the garden of white roses, and wondered, not for the first time, what her mother would have thought of the daughter staring back at her now. She did not cry. She had expected to, at some point during that long walk south, but the tears simply never came. Instead, something colder and more determined had settled into her chest, a quiet resolve that surprised even her. She would survive this. She would build something out of the wreckage Margaret had made of her life, even if it meant hiding her face behind a veil for the rest of her days. Outside her small window, the sounds of the village slowly quieted as night fell fully over Thornwick. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the faint howl of a wolf, long and low, carried on the cold evening wind, and for reasons she could not quite explain, the sound did not frighten her. If anything, it felt strangely fitting, as though the border territories themselves were welcoming her into a world where the line between monster and person had never been as clear as people liked to pretend. She lay back on the thin mattress, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes. Sleep did not come easily. Haunted as she was by the memory of green eyes glowing in candlelight, and the sound of her own screams echoing off stone walls. But eventually, exhaustion won out over fear, and Ivy drifted into a restless, dreamless sleep, the first night of what would become an entirely new life. She woke the next morning to the sound of Greta knocking softly on her door, a tray of bread and warm tea in hand, and the first thing Ivy did, before even reaching for the food, was pull the veil back over her face. It had already become instinct, a single night enough to teach her body the new shape of her existence. Beneath the veil, no one could see the ruin Margaret had made of her. Beneath the veil, she was simply a stranger passing through, and in the border territories, strangers were common enough that no one gave them a second glance. "You're up early," Greta said, setting the tray down on the small table. "Figured you'd sleep through most of the morning after a walk like that." "I don't sleep well in new places," Ivy said, which was true enough, though not for the reasons Greta likely assumed. Fair enough. Greta lingered by the door for a moment, studying the veiled woman, with something that might have been curiosity, or might have simply been the natural wariness of someone who had run an inn in a lawless border town for longer than she cared to admit. "You said you could pay for the room. You planning on staying long?" or just passing through? It was the question Ivy had been dreading and expecting in equal measure, and she realized, sitting there with the tray of bread untouched before her, that she did not actually have an answer. She had fled her home with nothing but a bag of coins and a veil, no plan beyond simply putting distance between herself and the woman who had cursed her. But now, faced with the practical reality of an empty room and a village she knew nothing about, she understood that she needed more than instinct to survive. "I'm not sure yet," Ivy admitted. "I may need work, if there's any to be found here. I have some skill with herbs and remedies. My mother taught me before she passed." Greta's expression shifted slightly, something like interest sparking behind her tired eyes. "Herbs and remedies, you say? Well, that's fortunate timing, if you don't mind me saying so. Old Marta, out past the mill, has been looking for someone to help her for months now. Her hands have gotten too stiff for the fine work, grinding roots and mixing tinctures, that sort of thing. Half the village relies on her when the fevers come through, and she's getting too old to keep up alone." Ivy felt something flicker to life in her chest, faint but unmistakable. Hope. "Do you think she would take on a stranger?" "Marta's not one for turning away anyone willing to work," Greta said with a small shrug. "She'll ask you questions, mind. She's sharp as a blade despite her age. But if you know your herbs, she'll teach you what she knows, and that's worth more out here than any coin." That very afternoon, Ivy made her way to the small cottage at the edge of the forest, following Greta's directions through winding dirt paths lined with wildflowers and tall grass. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and the scent of drying herbs hung thick in the air, even before she reached the front door. She knocked twice, her heart pounding beneath her veil, uncertain what kind of reception she would receive. The door opened to reveal a small, stooped woman with silver hair pulled into a tight braid, and eyes so sharp and pale they seemed to see straight through cloth and skin alike. Marta studied her for a long moment without speaking, her gaze lingering on the veil in a way that made Ivy's stomach tighten with unease. "You're the one Greta sent," Marta finally said. It was not a question. "Yes," Ivy answered. "My name is Ivy. I was told you might need help." "Come in then." Standing in doorways lets the cold air steal the heat from a body. Marta turned and shuffled back into the cottage, without waiting to see if Ivy would follow. Inside, the small space was crowded with shelves of dried herbs, clay jars, and bundled roots hanging from the low ceiling beams. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the whole room smelled of earth and mint, and something faintly bitter that Ivy could not immediately identify. Marta settled into a worn wooden chair near the fire, and gestured for Ivy to sit across from her. "Tell me what you know," Marta said. "And don't waste my time pretending to know more than you do. I'll find out the truth of it soon enough, one way or another." Ivy took a slow breath, gathering her thoughts. "My mother taught me the basics before she died. Willow bark for fevers and pain. Chamomile and lavender for calming the nerves and easing sleep. Comfrey for wounds and broken bones. I know how to make a poultice for infection, and I know which berries in the northern forests are safe to eat, and which will kill a grown man within the hour." Something shifted in Marta's expression, a flicker of genuine interest breaking through her earlier wariness. "Your mother taught you well, it seems. Most who come to me asking for work know nothing more than what they've heard from village gossip. Half of it wrong, and dangerous besides." She leaned forward slightly, studying Ivy's veiled face with renewed curiosity. "You keep that veil on indoors, by the fire, in front of an old woman who's seen more strange things in her years than most could imagine. Care to tell me why?" Ivy's hands tightened in her lap. This was the moment, she realized, when everything could fall apart. If Marta pressed for the truth and refused to work with someone unwilling to reveal her face, Ivy would be back where she started, alone in a strange village, with no purpose and no protection. "I was cursed," Ivy said finally, deciding that the truth, or at least a version close enough to it, was safer than any lie she might construct on the spot. "By someone who wished to see me suffer. I would rather not speak of the details. But the veil stays, if you're willing to have me. I promise you it changes nothing about the work I can do." Marta was quiet for a long moment, her sharp eyes studying Ivy with an intensity that made the younger woman want to look away, though she forced herself to hold steady. Finally, the old woman let out a low, thoughtful hum. "Curses are strange things," Marta said slowly. "I've seen a few in my time. more than most folks in these parts would believe. Jealousy curses, mostly. Spite curses. The kind cast by people who cannot stand to see something they've lost, still existing in someone else's hands. Her pale eyes narrowed slightly. Am I close? Ivy's breath caught in her throat. How did you know that? Because curses born of hatred and curses born of jealousy feel different, even from the outside, Marta said. I could feel something the moment you walked through my door, a kind of pressure in the air around you, like a held breath that never gets released. Jealousy curses are among the cruelest, in my experience, because they're never truly about the person they're cast upon. They're about the person casting them, and everything that person believes they deserve and does not have. Ivy said nothing, unable to find words for the strange mixture of relief and unease settling in her chest. It was the first time since fleeing her home that another person had looked at her, or rather, looked at the veil covering her, and understood something true about what had happened, without her having to explain every painful detail. I won't ask you to remove it, Marta continued, settling back into her chair. Not today. Not unless you choose to, in your own time. A face is a private thing, curse or no curse, and I've learned better than to demand what isn't freely offered. But I will tell you this. Curses like the one you're carrying, they don't always last forever. Some fade with time, some break under the right conditions. And some, she added, her pale eyes glinting with something that might have been knowledge, or might have simply been the flickering firelight, require something the person casting them never expected to happen at all. What kind of conditions? Ivy asked, leaning forward despite herself. Marta only smiled, a small, knowing expression that revealed nothing further. That, my dear, is a question for another day. For now, let's see if you truly know your herbs as well as you claim. There's a fever spreading through the village, children, and I could use an extra pair of steady hands. And so, without any further ceremony, Ivy's new life in Thornwick began. She spent that first afternoon grinding dried roots into fine powder, under Marta's careful instruction, her hands remembering skills her mother had taught her, years before the world had turned so cruel and strange. By evening, her fingers ached, and her back was sore from bending over the low work table, but for the first time since the curse had taken her old face, she felt something close to peace settle over her, quiet and fragile, but real. She did not know, as she walked back to the inn beneath a sky full of stars, that this small border village would become the place where she rebuilt herself from nothing. She did not know how many months would pass, how many fevers she would help break, and wounds she would help heal, how skilled her hands would become, and how far word of the mysterious veiled healer would eventually spread. She did not know that somewhere far to the north, in a kingdom of shifting shadows and ancient power, a wounded king was about to make a decision that would change the course of both their lives forever. All she knew, walking alone beneath the cold northern stars with the scent of dried herbs still clinging to her hands, was that she had survived the first night of her new existence, and she intended to survive every single night that followed, no matter what shape her face was forced to wear. Behind her, in the distance, the same low howl she had heard the night before echoed once more across the hills, closer now than it had been, though she did not yet understand why, or what it truly meant for the path her life was about to take. The child was not breathing. Ivy's hands moved faster than her thoughts, pressing 2 fingers against the small boy's throat, feeling for the faint flutter of a pulse that should not have been so weak in a child of 6 years old. Around her, the boy's mother was sobbing against the doorframe, and Marta stood at the edge of the room, her sharp eyes fixed on Ivy rather than on the patient, watching to see what her apprentice of nearly a year would do when a life truly hung in the balance. "Boil water now," Ivy said, her voice steady despite the frantic pounding of her own heart. "And bring me the tin box from the top shelf, the one marked with red string." The boy had fallen into the river 2 days before, pulled out barely alive by his older brother, and though he had seemed to recover at first, coughing and sputtering by the fire, the fever had crept in slowly, quietly, the way the worst fevers always did, until this morning when his lips had turned faintly blue, and his breathing had grown shallow and rattling. His mother had come running to Marta's cottage in a panic, and it was Ivy who had reached him first, Ivy whose hands now worked to save him, while Marta hung back, testing her, as she so often did these days. Ivy pried the boy's mouth open gently and pressed her ear to his chest, listening to the wet, labored sound of his breathing, the telltale rattle that told her his lungs had begun to fill with the very river water that had nearly claimed him 2 days earlier. She had read about this condition in one of Marta's oldest texts, a slow drowning that could happen even after a person seemed to have survived the water itself, and she knew there was very little time before the boy's small body simply gave out entirely. "The steam tent," Ivy said, already reaching for the pot Marta had set to boil. "We need eucalyptus, and the crushed thyme from the blue jar, and something to hold the steam close around him without smothering him." Marta finally moved, retrieving the ingredients with the efficient speed of someone who had spent decades in this exact position, though her eyes never left Ivy's veiled face, studying every decision, every movement, with the careful attention of a teacher who had begun to suspect her student might soon surpass her. Ivy built the steam tent with trembling but sure hands, propping a thin blanket over a frame of bent branches above the boy's small chest, directing the medicated steam upward into his struggling lungs. She pressed warm cloths against his feet and hands, remembering something her mother had taught her long ago about drawing heat and circulation back toward a body in shock. She spoke softly to him the entire time, though he could not hear her, gentle words of encouragement that felt strange leaving her lips from behind the veil, muffled and quiet, but she said them anyway, because somewhere deep inside her she believed that even unconscious children could sense when someone refused to give up on them. Minutes passed like hours. The boy's mother had gone silent, watching with wide, terrified eyes from the corner of the room, and even Marta had stopped testing and simply stood, quiet and still, as the steam curled up around the small, fragile body on the table. Then, finally, the boy coughed. It was a wet, violent cough, his small body convulsing with the force of it, and Ivy quickly turned him onto his side just as her mother had once taught her, allowing the water in his lungs to drain rather than choke him further. He coughed again and again, gasping in ragged breaths between each spasm, until finally his eyes fluttered open, glassy and confused but undeniably alive. His mother let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a cry of pure relief, rushing forward to gather her son into her arms despite Ivy's gentle warning to let him rest a moment longer. But Ivy could not blame her. She understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant to nearly lose someone, and then have them return to you, against all reasonable odds. "You did well," Marta said quietly, once the boy's mother had carried him home wrapped in warm blankets, promising to bring a basket of eggs and fresh bread as payment, once the family's chickens began laying again. "Better than well. I've seen healers with twice your experience lose children to lesser conditions than that." "I only did what you taught me," Ivy said, though a quiet warmth spread through her chest at the old woman's rare praise. "I taught you the herbs," Marta corrected, settling back into her chair by the fire with a tired sigh. "The rest, the calm hands in a moment of panic, the instinct to know exactly what a struggling body needs before it tells you, that isn't something that can be taught. That's simply who you are, Ivy, veil or no veil." It had been nearly a year since Ivy first arrived in Thornwick, and in that time, the frightened, grieving girl who had fled her family's estate in the middle of the night had slowly transformed into someone else entirely. She still wore the veil every single day, without exception, but beneath it, she had built a life that felt, in many ways, more genuinely hers than anything she had experienced within the cold stone walls of her father's house. She had learned every herb in Marta's extensive collection, and many more besides, venturing into the surrounding forests to gather roots and flowers the old woman had never bothered teaching, because she assumed no apprentice would ever need to know them. She had learned to set broken bones, to stitch deep wounds with steady, practiced hands, to recognize the early signs of a dozen different fevers and illnesses long before they became dangerous. She had learned, too, the quieter arts of healing, the ones that had nothing to do with herbs or stitches at all. The simple, powerful comfort of sitting with someone in pain and letting them know they were not facing it alone. Word of the veiled healer had spread slowly at first, whispered between villagers who came to Marta's cottage seeking treatment, and found, more often than not, that it was the quiet woman in the gray veil who tended to their wounds, while old Marta directed from her chair by the fire, her once steady hands, too stiff now for the finer, more delicate work. But slowly, over the passing months, the whispers had grown louder, traveling beyond Thornwick's borders to neighboring villages, carried by travelers and traders who had witnessed Ivy's skill firsthand. They're calling you something new, you know, Greta told her one evening, when Ivy stopped by the inn for a warm meal, after a particularly long day tending to a farmer's crushed hand. Heard it from a trader passing through yesterday. They're calling you the Veiled Healer of Thornwick. Word's spreading, Ivy. People are traveling from villages 2 days' ride from here just to seek you out. Ivy felt a strange flutter of unease at the words, though she tried not to let it show. Part of her, the part that still remembered green eyes glowing with hatred in candlelight, wanted desperately to remain unknown, invisible, safely hidden from anyone who might one day connect the mysterious Veiled Healer of the border territories to the missing daughter of a noble house far to the south. But another part of her, a part that had grown stronger with every life she helped save, every fever she helped break, every wound she helped close, felt something dangerously close to pride at the thought that her skill, at least, could not be taken from her, curse or no curse. Let them talk, Ivy said finally, offering Greta a small, tired smile hidden beneath her veil. As long as they keep bringing their coin along with their gossip. Greta laughed at that, a warm, genuine sound. Spoken like a true border woman already. You've changed since you first walked through that door, you know. Steadier, stronger, somehow, despite everything. It was true, though Ivy rarely allowed herself to reflect on it directly. The border territories had a way of stripping away pretense, of forcing a person to become exactly as capable as their circumstances demanded, and Ivy had risen to meet those demands again and again, until the frightened girl who had fled her home in the dark had become someone entirely new. She still thought of her father sometimes, wondering if he had ever searched for her, wondering if Margaret had spun some convincing lie to explain her sudden disappearance. She still thought of her mother's portrait in the East Hall, that laughing woman in the garden of white roses, and wondered what she would think of the daughter who had survived by hiding her face from the entire world. But mostly, these days, Ivy simply worked. She rose before dawn to gather fresh herbs while the morning dew still clung to the leaves, spent her days at Marta's side, treating whatever illness or injury walked through their door, and fell into bed each night exhausted but, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely content. The border territories were not an easy place to live. The winters were harsh. The summers brought their own dangers in the form of sudden storms and the occasional wandering predator that had strayed too far from the deeper forests. The nearby presence of the northern packs, the shape-shifting warriors who patrolled the kingdom's edges under the command of their Alpha King, was a constant, if distant, reminder that this land existed under a different kind of rule than the polished courts and careful laws of the southern provinces. But Ivy had come to appreciate the wildness of it, the honesty of a place where survival depended on skill and character rather than lineage or appearance. She heard stories about the Alpha King occasionally, carried by traders and travelers passing through Thornwick on their way to more distant villages. They called him Draven, though few claimed to have actually seen him up close, and the stories about him varied wildly depending on who was telling them. Some described him as a ruthless warrior, cold and untouchable, a man who had claimed his throne through strength alone and ruled with an iron will that brooked no challenge. Others spoke of him with something closer to reverence, describing a leader who had brought unprecedented peace and order to the border territories, who protected his people fiercely, even at great personal cost, who had never once taken a mate despite the many powerful families who had tried for years to arrange such a match. Ivy paid these stories little mind, at first. The affairs of kings and alphas felt impossibly distant from her small, herb-scented world in Marta's cottage, and she had more immediate concerns to occupy her thoughts. Patients to treat, remedies to prepare, and always, quietly, the persistent fear that someone from her old life might one day recognize her, despite the veil, and drag her back into a world she had worked so hard to escape. That fear nearly became reality on a cold autumn morning, nearly a year and a half after Ivy first arrived in Thornwick, when a merchant caravan passed through the village on its way toward the capital, and one of the traders, an older man with sharp eyes and an even sharper memory, paused mid-transaction at the village market to study Ivy's veiled figure with unsettling intensity. "Forgive me," he said slowly, his voice carrying just enough curiosity to make Ivy's stomach tighten with alarm. "But you remind me strongly of a young woman I once saw, years ago now, at a noble house far to the south. A healer's daughter, I believe, though I can't recall the family's name precisely." "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Ivy said, keeping her voice carefully even, despite the sudden racing of her heart beneath the veil. I've lived in these border territories my whole life. The traitor studied her a moment longer, his expression thoughtful, and Ivy braced herself for further questions, already calculating how quickly she might need to disappear if this conversation continued down a dangerous path. But finally he simply shrugged, the moment of recognition apparently fading as quickly as it had arrived. My mistake then, he said. Forgive an old man's failing memory. You simply carry yourself the way she did, I suppose. A certain grace in how you move, despite the veil. He returned to his transaction, and Ivy forced herself to breathe normally, to continue gathering the supplies she had come to the market for, though her hands trembled slightly for the rest of that afternoon. It was a small moment, quickly forgotten by everyone else present, but it served as a sharp, unwelcome reminder that her old life had not vanished entirely, that somewhere out there, people still existed who might recognize something familiar in the way she carried herself, veil or no veil, curse or no curse. That night, lying awake in her small room above the inn, Ivy found herself thinking more seriously than she had in months about the nature of the curse Margaret had placed upon her. Marta had mentioned, all those months ago, that curses born of jealousy sometimes required specific conditions to break, conditions the person casting them never expected to occur. Ivy had never pressed the old woman for more details, too afraid, perhaps, of hoping for something that might never come to pass. But lying there in the darkness, listening to the distant howl of wolves carried on the cold autumn wind, she found herself wondering, for the first time in a long while, whether her ruined face might not be a permanent sentence after all. She did not dare hope too much. Hope, she had learned over the past year and a half, was a dangerous thing to carry too openly, in a world that had already taken so much from her. But the small, stubborn ember of it remained regardless, buried deep beneath layers of caution and hard-won practicality, waiting quietly for whatever circumstances might one day fan it back into flame. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a series of harsh storms that swept down from the northern mountains and buried Thornwick beneath thick blankets of snow. The village settled into its familiar seasonal rhythm, and Ivy found herself busier than ever, treating frostbite and winter fevers, the seasonal ailments that always seemed to strike hardest when the days grew shortest and the nights grew longest and coldest. It was during one of these brutal winter storms, nearly 2 years after Ivy first arrived in the border territories, that everything began to change. The night the storm hit hardest, howling wind rattling the shutters of every building in Thornwick, a frantic knock echoed against Marta's cottage door well past midnight. Ivy startled awake from where she had fallen asleep by the fire, having stayed late to finish preparing a batch of winter tonics, and rushed to answer it before the pounding could wake Marta from her rest in the back room. She opened the door to find a young man she did not recognize, his face pale with cold and fear, snow clinging to his heavy fur cloak. "Please," he gasped, barely able to catch his breath. "You're the healer, aren't you? The veiled one, from Thornwick?" "I am," Ivy said, already reaching for her cloak, sensing the urgency in his voice. "What's happened?" "A hunting party," the young man said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Attacked by something in the deep forest, near the northern ridge. Most of the men are wounded, but one of them, he's hurt badly, worse than I've ever seen. They sent me ahead on the fastest horse to find help before it's too late." Ivy did not hesitate. She grabbed her healer's bag, already stocked with the supplies she might need for severe injuries, and followed the young man out into the howling winter storm, her veil pulled tight against her face, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce determination. She did not know, as she climbed onto the horse behind the frantic messenger and rode out into the freezing darkness, that she was about to meet the wounded man who would change the entire course of her carefully rebuilt life. She did not know that the injured hunter waiting for her at the northern ridge was not simply another patient to be treated and forgotten, but the Alpha King himself, gravely wounded, and closer to death than he had been in many years, about to place his trust, for reasons even he did not yet fully understand, in the steady hands of a mysterious veiled healer he had never before met. The wind howled around them as the horse thundered through the snow-covered forest, and somewhere ahead, in the darkness beyond the trees, fate was already beginning to weave together two lives that had, until this very night, existed in entirely separate worlds. Blood soaked through the makeshift bandages wrapped around the man's side, dark and spreading despite the desperate efforts of the two hunters trying to hold pressure against the wound. Ivy slid off the horse before it had fully stopped, her boots sinking into deep snow, and pushed her way through the small circle of frightened men, gathered around the fallen figure lying against the base of a massive pine tree. "Move aside," she said, her voice carrying a sharp authority that made the men step back immediately, despite not knowing who she was. Now. The wounded man was larger than anyone she had ever treated before, his broad shoulders and powerful frame stretched out across the snow, dark hair matted with blood and sweat, his skin pale beneath a layer of grime and dirt from whatever violent struggle had brought him to this state. Even in his weakened condition, there was something undeniably commanding about him, a presence that seemed to fill the small clearing despite his injuries. "What happened to him?" Ivy demanded, already kneeling beside him and pulling back the blood-soaked cloth to assess the wound beneath. "A creature," one of the hunters stammered, his voice shaking with cold and fear. "Something we've never seen before, out past the northern ridge. It came at us without warning, and he threw himself in front of the rest of us before it could reach the younger men, took the worst of the attack himself." Ivy examined the wound quickly, her trained eyes cataloging the damage with practiced efficiency, despite the dim light of the single lantern one of the hunters held aloft against the darkness. Deep claw marks tore across his side, 4 parallel gashes that had cut through muscle, and dangerously close to something far more vital. Blood continued to seep steadily from the wound, despite the pressure being applied, and his breathing, though still steady, carried a faint, wet rattle that worried her more than the visible injury itself. "He's bleeding internally," Ivy said, more to herself than to the frightened men around her. "The claws went deeper than they appear. We need to move him somewhere warm immediately, and I need my full supply of herbs, not just what I brought in this bag." "There's a hunting lodge, less than a mile from here," one of the older hunters offered. "We were making for it when the creature attacked." "Then we go there, now, before he loses any more blood in this cold." They fashioned a makeshift stretcher from cut branches and cloaks, and Ivy walked alongside it the entire way, maintaining steady pressure on the wound, despite the biting wind and deepening snow, refusing to let the bleeding worsen even for a moment. The wounded man remained unconscious throughout the journey, his breathing growing shallower with each passing minute, and Ivy found herself murmuring quiet, steady words of encouragement to him, the same instinctive comfort she offered every patient whose life hung precariously in the balance, though she doubted, in his current state, that he could hear any of it. The hunting lodge, when they finally reached it, was small but sturdy, built of thick logs with a large stone hearth, already holding the remnants of a dying fire from some previous visit. Ivy directed the hunters to lay him gently on the wide wooden table near the fireplace, and immediately set to work rebuilding the flames to a roaring blaze, knowing that warmth would be as crucial to his survival as any herb or stitch she might apply. "I need boiling water," she said, already unpacking her supplies with quick, efficient movements. "And someone needs to hold him steady, because this is going to hurt him even unconscious, and I cannot risk him thrashing while I work." The next several hours passed in a blur of intense concentration. Ivy cleaned the deep wounds with practiced precision, carefully checking for any sign that the claws had pierced something truly vital, relieved to find that while the damage was severe, it had narrowly missed the organs that would have made survival impossible. She packed the wounds with a mixture of herbs designed to prevent infection and encourage clotting, working with steady hands despite the exhaustion and cold pressing in from every direction, and finally began the long, careful process of stitching the torn flesh back together. The wounded man stirred only once during the entire procedure, his eyes fluttering open for a brief, disoriented moment as pain broke through whatever depths of unconsciousness had claimed him. His gaze, when it finally focused, landed directly on Ivy's veiled face, and for a strange, suspended moment, something passed between them that neither of them could later fully explain, a flicker of recognition that made no logical sense, given they had never met before this night. "Who?" he managed to rasp, his voice rough and weak. "Are you?" "Someone trying to keep you alive," Ivy answered simply, not pausing in her work. "Be still. This will hurt less if you don't fight it." He did not fight it, though his jaw clenched hard against the pain, and his eyes remained fixed on her veiled face, until the exhaustion of his injuries finally pulled him back under, his body going limp once more beneath her steady hands. By the time the first pale light of dawn began filtering through the lodge's small windows, Ivy had finished stitching and dressing every wound, and the man's breathing, while still weak, had steadied considerably, the dangerous rattle in his chest quieting as the internal bleeding slowed and finally stopped entirely. She sat back on her heels, exhausted beyond measure, her hands stained red despite her best efforts to keep them clean, and allowed herself a small, relieved breath for the first time in hours. "Will he live?" one of the hunters asked quietly from the corner of the room, where he and his companions had kept a worried vigil throughout the entire ordeal. "If the wounds don't turn to infection over the next few days, yes," Ivy said, gathering her supplies with tired but careful movements. "He needs rest, warmth, and someone to change these bandages regularly and watch for any sign of fever. Beyond that, it's up to his own strength now, and from what I've seen tonight, he seems to have plenty of that." It was only then, in the quiet aftermath of the crisis, that she finally allowed herself to look more closely at the man she had just spent the entire night working to save, and something about his features, even slack with unconsciousness and pale from blood loss, struck her as unusual. There was a certain wildness to him even in stillness, a coiled strength beneath the surface that seemed almost impossible to fully mask, even in his current weakened state. "Do any of you know his name?" she asked, curious despite herself. The hunters exchanged uneasy glances, and Ivy immediately sensed something significant in their hesitation. "You truly don't know?" the older hunter asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Should I?" "That," the young man who had first come to fetch her said slowly, "is Draven, king of the northern packs, alpha of every wolf territory from here to the mountain borders." Ivy's hands went still for a moment, her heart giving an unexpected lurch beneath her chest. She had heard countless stories about the Alpha King during her time in the border territories, whispered tales of ruthless strength and unmatched power, and yet here he lay, utterly vulnerable, saved by her own two exhausted hands, entirely unaware that a stranger's veiled healer had just pulled him back from the edge of death. "I see," she said finally, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the sudden weight of understanding settling over her. "Well, he's still just a man beneath the crown, it seems, when the claws find their mark." One of the younger hunters let out a startled, disbelieving laugh at her words, quickly stifled behind his hand, though the older hunter's expression remained grave. "You should be careful how you speak of him, even in his current state," the older man warned, though not unkindly. "He is not a man who takes disrespect lightly, even from those who have saved his life." "I meant no disrespect," Ivy said honestly. "Only that illness and injury care nothing for titles or crowns. They treat everybody the same, king or farmer alike." The older hunter studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his weathered expression, though he said nothing further on the matter. They remained at the lodge for the next 3 days, while Draven's condition slowly stabilized, and Ivy found herself unable to leave his side for more than a few hours at a time, driven by both professional dedication and a curiosity she could not quite explain even to herself. She changed his bandages twice daily, checking carefully for any sign of infection setting into the deep wounds, and administered a steady regimen of herbs, designed to strengthen his blood and speed his recovery. He drifted in and out of consciousness during those first 2 days, fever gripping him intermittently despite her best efforts, and Ivy sat with him through the worst of it, pressing cool cloths against his burning forehead, and murmuring the same steady words of comfort she offered every patient, though something about offering that comfort to this particular man felt different in a way she could not quite name. On the 3rd day, his fever finally broke entirely, and he woke fully lucid for the first time since the attack, his sharp eyes immediately finding her veiled figure sitting in the chair beside his bed. "You're still here," he said, his voice stronger now, though still carrying the rasp of exhaustion. "Someone needed to make sure you didn't undo 3 days of careful stitching by moving around too soon," Ivy replied, checking his temperature with the back of her hand against his forehead, a gesture so natural after 3 days of tending him that she barely registered how casually intimate it might appear to an outside observer. He studied her for a long, silent moment, his golden brown eyes moving slowly over the gray veil covering her features, and Ivy felt herself tense slightly under the weight of that scrutiny. half expecting the same probing questions she had grown accustomed to deflecting from curious strangers. But instead, he simply asked, "What's your name?" "Ivy." "Just Ivy?" "Just Ivy," she confirmed, offering nothing further. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, though it faded quickly beneath the lingering exhaustion of his injuries. "The hunters told me what you did, that you rode out into a winter storm, without a moment's hesitation to save a stranger's life. I did what any healer would do." "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You did what very few healers would do, considering the storm, considering the wound, considering that you had no idea who you were riding out to save. Most people, even skilled ones, would have waited for morning, waited for safer conditions. You didn't." Ivy shifted uncomfortably under his direct gaze, unused to this kind of pointed gratitude from patients, most of whom simply paid their fees and returned to their lives, without much further reflection on the healer who had treated them. "I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd waited, and you died because of it. Even not knowing who I was? Especially not knowing who you were," Ivy said honestly. "A life is a life, whether it belongs to a farmer or a king. I didn't need to know your name to know you deserved the chance to keep it." Something shifted in his expression at those words, a flicker of genuine surprise breaking through the careful composure he seemed to naturally carry even while weakened and bedridden. He studied her for another long moment, and Ivy found herself holding perfectly still beneath that scrutiny, uncertain what he might be searching for in the limited expression visible above her veil. "You're not from Thornwick originally," he said finally, and it was not quite a question. Ivy's heart gave an uneasy lurch. "What makes you say that?" "The way you speak, the way you carry yourself. There's something in it that doesn't quite match a lifelong border village upbringing." His golden eyes remained steady on her veiled face. "I don't ask to pry into your past, Ivy. I ask because I find myself curious about the woman who saved my life. And curiosity, in my experience, is rarely satisfied by half answers." "Everyone has a past they'd rather leave buried," Ivy said carefully, choosing her words with deliberate caution. "Mine simply happens to be one I prefer to keep to myself. I hope that doesn't offend you, given the circumstances." To her surprise, rather than pressing further, he simply nodded, a gesture that carried something close to respect. "It doesn't offend me. If anything, it earns my respect further. Too many people in my life offer up every detail of themselves the moment they learn my title, hoping to gain some advantage from the sharing. You've offered me nothing but honest care and a name, and somehow that means more to me than every elaborate courtesy I've received from nobles seeking my favor." Ivy did not know quite how to respond to that, so she said nothing, focusing instead on checking the stitches along his side, relieved to find the wounds healing cleanly, without any sign of the infection she had feared. "You're healing well," she said finally, grateful for the shift back to practical matters. "Another few days of rest, and you should be strong enough to travel, though I'd advise against anything strenuous, for at least 2 more weeks after that." "I don't have the luxury of 2 more weeks of rest," Draven said, a note of weariness entering his voice. "There's territory business waiting for me. Decisions that cannot simply pause because I was foolish enough to walk into an ambush I should have sensed coming." "Foolish is throwing yourself in front of a creature to protect younger hunters who couldn't defend themselves," Ivy said before she could stop herself. "I'd hardly call that foolish." He looked at her again, something warmer entering his expression this time. "You have a sharp tongue for someone treating a king. You have a habit of running into danger for someone responsible for an entire territory," Ivy shot back, though there was no real malice in it, only the easy banter that had somehow developed between them over the past 3 days of close, constant care. He laughed then, a genuine, surprised sound that seemed to catch even him off guard, and Ivy felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at having drawn that reaction from a man everyone described as cold and untouchable. It was in that moment, watching him laugh despite his injuries, that Ivy began to understand this encounter was going to change something fundamental about the careful, isolated life she had built for herself over the past 2 years. She did not yet know exactly how, or to what extent, but she understood, with a certainty she could not fully explain, that the Alpha King of the Northern Pax was not going to simply thank her for her service and disappear back into the distant world of politics and territory business she had always assumed existed entirely separate from her own quiet life in Thornwick. She was right to sense it, though even she could not have predicted, in that moment, just how significant this chance meeting in a winter storm was about to become for both of their lives. "Absolutely not," Ivy said, crossing her arms beneath her cloak. "You are not walking out of this lodge on your own 2 feet after only 5 days. The stitches will tear." Draven, already sitting upright on the edge of the wide wooden table that had served as his sickbed, gave her a look that clearly suggested he was used to people obeying his commands, rather than the reverse. "I've survived worse wounds in half the recovery time, Ivy. My territory needs its alpha, not a bedridden invalid hiding in a hunting lodge while decisions pile up in my absence. Your territory will need its alpha considerably more if you tear those stitches open and bleed out on the road home," Ivy countered, unmoved by the authority in his tone. She had spent 3 years treating stubborn patients who believed their own toughness exempted them from the basic realities of injury and recovery. And kings, she was quickly learning, were no exception to that particular pattern. The 2 hunters who had remained to assist during his recovery exchanged a look that Ivy did not entirely miss, something between amusement and disbelief at watching their formidable Alpha King be so thoroughly challenged by a veiled healer half his size. "I'll ride," Draven said, a note of finality in his voice. "Slowly. You can accompany us if it eases your concerns." Ivy considered this for a moment, weighing the practical reality that she could not physically stop a grown man determined to leave against the genuine medical risk of him traveling too soon. "Fine, but I'm changing your bandages before we leave, and you will stop the moment I say stop, regardless of how close we are to wherever you're taking us." "Agreed," Draven said, something almost like amusement flickering across his features, despite his obvious impatience to return to his duties. They departed the hunting lodge that afternoon, moving at a careful pace through snow that had begun to melt slightly, under a brief spell of warmer weather. Ivy rode alongside Draven, watching him closely for any sign of strain or reopening injury, while the 2 hunters who had accompanied them from the beginning rode ahead and behind, forming a loose but watchful escort. It was during this slow journey that Ivy first began to understand the true scope of what Draven's territory actually encompassed. She had known, in the vague way most people knew things about distant, powerful figures, that the Alpha King ruled over the northern packs and the border territories beyond them, but she had not fully grasped the sheer size and complexity of what that rule actually involved, until they crested a final hill, and she saw, spread out before them in the valley below, the sprawling fortress city that served as Draven's seat of power. It was nothing like the polished stone estates of the southern provinces where Ivy had grown up. The city was built into the natural landscape rather than imposed upon it, structures of dark timber and gray stone rising organically from the hillside, connected by winding paths and bridges that seemed to follow the natural contours of the land, rather than any rigid architectural plan. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, and even from this distance, Ivy could hear the faint sounds of a bustling settlement, voices and activity, carrying on the cold winter air. "That's Ashcrest," Draven said, noticing her attention. "Seat of the northern packs for nearly 2 centuries now. It's grown considerably since my grandfather's time." "It's larger than I expected," Ivy admitted. "Most people expect us to live in caves and forests, howling at the moon," Draven said with a dry note of humor. "The old stories tend to exaggerate certain aspects of pack life while entirely ignoring others." As they descended toward the city, Ivy became increasingly aware of the curious glances being cast their way by the guards stationed along the outer perimeter, their expressions shifting from initial alarm at seeing their wounded alpha to open curiosity at the sight of the veiled stranger, riding steadily by his side. Word of what had happened, it seemed, had already begun to spread ahead of their actual arrival, likely carried by messengers sent forward from the hunting lodge in the days since the attack. They were met at the main gates by a tall, severe-looking woman, with steel-gray hair, pulled back into a tight braid, her expression shifting rapidly from relief to concern, as she took in Draven's still careful movements, and the fresh scarring visible along his exposed side, where his torn shirt had never been properly replaced. "You look terrible," the woman said bluntly, falling into step beside them as they entered the fortress grounds. "It's good to see you too, Helka," Draven said, a note of genuine affection entering his tired voice, despite her harsh greeting. "The council has been asking questions for 5 days, wondering why their alpha vanished into a routine hunting expedition, and simply never returned, Helka continued, her sharp eyes flicking briefly toward Ivy, before returning to Draven. I've been managing what I could, but there are decisions only you can make, and they're piling up faster than I can hold them back. I'm aware, Draven said, a note of weariness creeping into his voice. I'll address the council tomorrow, once I've rested properly tonight. Helka's gaze shifted again toward Ivy, more openly assessing this time. And this is? Ivy, Draven said simply. The healer who saved my life. I'd like her given quarters within the fortress, and I want it made clear to the household staff that she's to be treated as an honored guest for as long as she chooses to remain. Ivy's breath caught slightly at the unexpected announcement, having assumed, without ever fully articulating the thought, that once they reached Ashcrest, her involvement would naturally conclude, and she would be sent back to Thornwick with whatever payment Draven deemed appropriate for her services. That's not necessary, Ivy said quickly. I have obligations back in Thornwick, an elderly healer who depends on my assistance. I'll send word, and appropriate compensation to ensure your absence causes her no hardship, Draven said, turning to look at her directly, for the first time since their arrival at the fortress gates. But I would like you to remain, at least until I'm fully certain the wounds have healed properly, and no infection develops in the coming weeks. Consider it a continuation of the same care you've already provided. It was, Ivy recognized, a reasonable enough request on its surface, a practical continuation of medical care, rather than anything more significant. And yet something in the way he looked at her as he said it suggested the request carried weight beyond simple medical necessity, though she could not have said, in that moment, exactly what that additional weight might be. I'll need to send word to Marta myself, Ivy said finally. She'll worry if I simply vanish without explanation. Of course, Helka will arrange a messenger immediately. And so, almost before she fully understood how it had happened, Ivy found herself settling into a small but comfortable set of rooms within the sprawling fortress of Ashcrest, tasked with continuing to oversee the recovery of the most powerful man in the entire Northern Territories, a responsibility that felt simultaneously like an honor and a dangerous complication to the carefully guarded, anonymous life she had built for herself over the past several years. The following weeks passed in a rhythm that gradually became familiar despite its unusual circumstances. Ivy checked on Draven's healing wounds each morning and evening, monitoring for any sign of infection or complication, while spending the remainder of her days largely to herself, exploring the fortress grounds and, when invited, assisting the small medical staff that served Ashcrest's substantial population. She learned, during this time, that the northern packs operated under a system quite different from the rigid noble hierarchies of the southern provinces she had grown up within. Status among the packs was earned through demonstrated strength, wisdom, and service, rather than simply inherited through bloodline, and while Draven certainly commanded absolute authority as Alpha King, the relationship between him and his people carried a rawer, more immediate quality than the distant, formal respect Ivy had witnessed between her own father and the servants of their southern estate. She also began to notice, with a growing unease she found difficult to fully suppress, that Draven sought out her company far more often than strict medical necessity required. He would find reasons to walk with her through the fortress gardens during her afternoon herb-gathering excursions, would linger over conversations that had nothing to do with his healing wounds, would seek her opinion on matters of territory governance that seemed, on their surface, entirely unrelated to anything a wandering healer might reasonably be expected to understand. "Why do you ask me these things?" Ivy finally questioned him one evening, several weeks into her stay, as they walked together, along the fortress's outer wall, beneath a clear, star-filled sky. "Surely you have advisors far more qualified than a border village healer to weigh in on matters of trade agreements and territorial disputes." "I have advisors who tell me what they think I want to hear," Draven said, his voice thoughtful as he gazed out over the moonlit valley beyond the fortress walls. "Or advisors who tell me what benefits their own particular interests within the pack hierarchy. You have no stake in any of it, Ivy. No family seeking advancement, no faction hoping to gain my favor. When I ask your opinion, I know I'm getting an honest one, unclouded by anything except your own genuine judgment." "That's a lonely way to rule," Ivy said quietly, surprising herself with the honesty of the observation. Draven was quiet for a long moment, his golden eyes still fixed on the distant valley. "It is," he admitted finally. Lonelier than most people realize, being the one everyone looks to for every decision, every judgment, every resolution to every conflict, while never quite being certain who around you values your actual judgment, rather than simply the power your judgment carries. And you think I'm different? I know you're different, he said, turning to look at her directly. You saved my life without knowing who I was, and you've spent every day since treating me exactly the same as you treated me back at that hunting lodge, stubborn king or otherwise. You argue with me, Ivy. Do you understand how rare that is for someone in my position? Nearly everyone around me either fears me or wants something from me. You do neither. Ivy felt something warm and uncertain unfurl in her chest at his words, an emotion she was not entirely prepared to examine too closely, given the impossible gap that existed between them. An alpha king, and a veiled healer hiding from a curse she had never explained to a single soul within these fortress walls. I should return to Thornwick soon, she said instead, deflecting from the growing intimacy of the moment. Your wounds have healed well. There's no longer any medical reason for me to remain. Something shifted in Draven's expression at her words, a flicker of what might have been disappointment, quickly smoothed over by careful composure. Is that truly what you want? To return to Thornwick? Ivy hesitated, uncertain how to answer honestly, without revealing more than she was prepared to share. The truth was complicated. Part of her missed the simple, predictable rhythm of her life with Marta, the quiet satisfaction of village work, far removed from the complex politics and constant scrutiny of fortress life. But another part of her, a part she was only beginning to fully acknowledge, had grown genuinely attached to these evening walks, to Draven's unexpected warmth beneath his formidable exterior, to the strange, careful friendship that had developed between them over these past several weeks. I don't know what I want, she admitted finally, the honesty costing her something to voice aloud. My life has been complicated for reasons I haven't shared with you, reasons I'm not certain I'm ready to share with anyone. Thornwick offered me safety and purpose when I needed both desperately. But I won't pretend these past weeks haven't offered something else entirely, something I didn't expect to find. Draven studied her for a long, silent moment, and Ivy held perfectly still beneath his gaze, uncertain what he might say next, uncertain what she even wanted him to say. Stay, he said finally, the single word carrying more weight than she had anticipated, not simply as a healer overseeing my recovery, but as someone whose presence I've come to genuinely value. I'm not asking you to explain whatever burden you're carrying beneath that veil, Ivy. I'm simply asking you to consider staying, and letting whatever this has become between us continue to grow, at whatever pace feels right to you. The offer hung in the cold night air between them, simple in its wording, but immense in its implications, and Ivy found herself facing a decision that would shape the entire remainder of her carefully rebuilt life, whichever direction she ultimately chose. The wine goblet shattered against the stone floor, and every conversation in the great hall stopped at once. Forgive me, Lady Corrine said sweetly, though her eyes carried no apology whatsoever, as she stared directly at Ivy across the crowded room. My hand slipped. I do find it so difficult to keep my composure around such mysterious company. Ivy said nothing, simply inclining her head slightly in acknowledgement, before turning her attention back to the conversation she had been having with one of the fortress physicians about a new treatment for winter fevers. She had learned, over the past several months since accepting Draven's offer to remain at Ashcrest, that Lady Corrine's small cruelties were best met with calm indifference, rather than any reaction that might give the woman further satisfaction. Lady Corrine came from one of the most powerful pack families within Draven's territory, her father commanding significant influence on the ruling council, and she had made her interest in becoming Draven's mate abundantly clear since long before Ivy's arrival had ever complicated her carefully laid plans. She was beautiful in a sharp, calculated way that reminded Ivy uncomfortably of Margaret, though Ivy tried not to dwell too long on that particular comparison, unwilling to let old wounds color her judgment of every ambitious woman she encountered. She grows bolder each week, murmured Helka, appearing at Ivy's side, with the quiet efficiency that had become characteristic of the fortress's chief steward over the months Ivy had spent living within Ashcrest's walls. The council meets again tomorrow, and her father intends to formally propose the matter of Draven's mating once more. They grow impatient with his continued refusal to consider any of the eligible candidates from within the pack families. That's hardly my concern, Ivy said, though the words felt hollow, even as she spoke them. Helka gave her a knowing look, one that suggested the older woman understood far more about the true nature of Ivy's relationship with Draven than either of them had ever directly acknowledged. Isn't it though? You've been at his side for nearly 6 months now, Ivy. People notice these things, whatever careful boundaries you and Draven maintain in public. It was true, and Ivy had felt the growing weight of that scrutiny increasingly over recent weeks. What had begun as evening walks and careful conversations had slowly deepened into something neither of them had ever formally named, but both clearly understood, a bond built on honesty and mutual respect that had grown steadily stronger, despite the enormous secret Ivy still kept hidden beneath her veil. Draven had never once pressed her to reveal her face, had never once questioned her past beyond what she volunteered on her own terms, and that patient, unwavering respect had done more to earn Ivy's trust than any grand romantic gesture could have accomplished. But their growing closeness had not gone unnoticed by the Pack families who had long assumed Draven's eventual mate would come from among their own powerful bloodlines, and Lady Kareen's small cruelties represented only the most visible symptom of a deeper, more dangerous undercurrent of resentment building throughout the fortress court. "You should be careful," Helka said quietly, her sharp eyes scanning the crowded hall with practiced wariness. "Kareen's family has resources beyond simple social maneuvering. If they feel sufficiently threatened by your presence, they may seek other means of removing whatever obstacle you represent to their ambitions." "What kind of means?" Ivy asked, a note of genuine concern entering her voice for the first time. "I don't know precisely," Helka admitted. "But I've served this fortress for over 3 decades, and I've watched ambitious families do far worse than shatter wine goblets when their plans for advancement are threatened. Watch yourself, Ivy, and watch anyone who seems overly curious about matters you'd rather keep private." The warning proved prophetic sooner than either of them anticipated. Less than a week later, Ivy returned to her fortress quarters to find her personal belongings had clearly been disturbed. Subtle, but unmistakable signs that someone had searched through her few possessions during her absence, though nothing appeared to have actually been taken. She reported the incident to Helka immediately, and though the fortress steward promised to increase security around Ivy's chambers, both women understood the deeper implication of what had occurred. Someone was actively investigating her past, searching for information that might explain the mysterious veil she never removed, seeking whatever leverage might be found in whatever secrets she was so carefully protecting. Ivy raised her concerns with Draven that same evening, finding him in his private study reviewing a stack of territory reports by candlelight. "Someone searched my quarters today," she said without preamble, watching his expression shift immediately from tired concentration to sharp alertness. "What did they take?" "Nothing, as far as I could tell, but everything had been moved, searched through carefully. Someone was looking for something specific." Draven's jaw tightened, a flash of genuine anger crossing his features before he carefully controlled it. "Kareen's family, most likely, or one of the other pack houses growing anxious about my continued reluctance to formalize a mating arrangement within their preferred candidates." He set down the report he had been reviewing, giving her his full attention. "I'll increase the guard around your quarters immediately. This cannot continue." "Draven," Ivy said carefully, "perhaps it would be simpler if I returned to Thornwick. My continued presence here is clearly creating dangerous tension within your court. Tension that has nothing to do with my healing skills and everything to do with the position people assume I occupy in your personal life." "Is that what you want?" he asked, his voice carrying a careful neutrality that did not fully mask the concern beneath it. "It's not about what I want," Ivy said. "It's about what's practical and safe for both of us." Draven rose from his desk and crossed the room to stand before her, his golden eyes searching her veiled face with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly, despite the seriousness of the conversation. "I have spent my entire life doing what was practical for my territory, Ivy. Making decisions based on strategic necessity rather than genuine desire. I am not willing to do that with this, not with you. Even knowing what dangerous complications my presence creates within your court, especially knowing that," he said. "Because the alternative, letting fear of complication drive away the one person in this fortress who has never once wanted anything from me except my honest company, feels like a far greater loss than any political tension Kareen's family might stir up." Ivy felt something shift and settle deep within her chest at his words, a fragile but growing certainty that whatever this had become between them, was worth navigating the dangers now surrounding it. Then we face it together, she said finally. Whatever comes. Together. Draven agreed, reaching up to gently touch the edge of her veil, though he did not attempt to move it, respecting, even in this intimate moment, the boundary she had maintained since the very first night they met. Though I would ask you to trust me with one thing, Ivy. Whatever you're protecting beneath this veil, whatever happened to bring you to Thornwick in the first place, I want you to know that it changes nothing about how I feel toward you. Whatever waits beneath, I have already decided it does not matter. The words settled over Ivy like a warm blanket against the cold uncertainty that had followed her every day since Margaret's curse first took her face, and for the first time since that terrible night, she found herself daring to imagine a future where the truth might finally come to light, without destroying everything she had carefully rebuilt. But that dangerous hope proved short-lived. 3 weeks later, a new visitor arrived at Ashcrest's gates, announced with all the formal ceremony reserved for significant nobility from beyond the northern territories. Ivy was in the fortress gardens gathering winter herbs when Helka found her, the older woman's face carrying an expression of grave concern that immediately set Ivy's instincts on high alert. "There's a visitor at the main gates," Helka said without preamble. "A noblewoman from the southern provinces, traveling under diplomatic pretense to discuss trade relations between her territory and the northern pacts." "Why does this concern me?" Ivy asked, though something cold was already settling into her stomach, even before Helka finished speaking. "Because she's specifically requesting an audience with the Alpha King's healer," Helka said. "By name, Ivy. She's asking for you specifically, and she's brought a considerable entourage that includes several individuals I don't recognize from any of the trade delegations I've dealt with previously." Ivy's blood ran cold. "What's her name?" Helka's expression grew even more troubled. "Lady Margaret. From what I understand, she recently remarried into a fairly prominent southern noble house, though her original family name apparently carried considerable weight in its own right before that marriage." The herbs Ivy had been gathering slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, scattering across the frozen ground as her worst fear finally arrived, uninvited and utterly unwelcome, at the very gates of the sanctuary she had so carefully built for herself. Margaret had found her. "You look pale," Margaret said, her voice carrying that same false sweetness Ivy remembered from every cruel moment of her childhood, as the woman swept into the great hall of Ashcrest, surrounded by her small entourage of southern attendants. "Has the northern climate not agreed with you, my dear? Or perhaps you're simply surprised to see a familiar face after all this time." The great hall had fallen into an uneasy silence, the assembled pack nobility and council members watching the exchange with undisguised curiosity, sensing that something significant was unfolding beneath the formal diplomatic pleasantries being exchanged. Draven stood at Ivy's side, his posture carefully composed, but his golden eyes sharp with wariness as he studied the southern noblewoman who had arrived specifically requesting to see his healer. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Ivy said carefully, her voice steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart beneath her veil. "You have the advantage of me, my lady." Something flickered behind Margaret's pale gray eyes, amusement mixed with something colder and more calculating. "How curious. I could have sworn we were quite well acquainted, once upon a time. Perhaps I'm simply mistaken. It has been several years since we last crossed paths, after all, and people do change so much given enough time." "Lady Margaret," Draven said, his voice carrying the formal authority of his position, "you requested this audience under the pretense of discussing trade relations between our territories. I trust that remains the true purpose of your visit." "Of course, Your Majesty," Margaret said smoothly, offering a graceful bow that carried just the right measure of respectful deference. "Though I confess, I was also rather hoping to reconnect with an old acquaintance during my visit. Your healer here bears such a striking resemblance to someone I once knew quite well, before circumstances separated us rather abruptly." Ivy felt every eye in the great hall shift toward her, curiosity and suspicion mingling in equal measure among the assembled nobility, several of whom had already grown wary of her mysterious presence within their Alpha King's inner circle. This was precisely the danger she had feared since the moment Helka informed her of Margaret's arrival, the possibility that her carefully guarded secret might finally be exposed in the most public and humiliating manner possible. "I'm afraid you must be mistaken," Ivy said again. forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the rising panic threatening to overwhelm her. "I've made my home in the Northern Territories for many years now." "Have you?" Margaret's smile sharpened slightly, though her tone remained perfectly pleasant to any observer, unfamiliar with the true weight behind her words. "How strange. I could have sworn a young woman matching your general description simply vanished from my household some years ago, under rather mysterious circumstances. Her father was devastated, of course. Still holds out hope, even now, that she might someday return home." The mention of her father sent an unexpected pang through Ivy's chest, guilt and longing intertwining painfully despite the years that had passed since she last saw him. But she forced herself to maintain her composure, aware that any visible reaction would only confirm whatever suspicions Margaret had clearly arrived intending to prove. "A touching story," Ivy said, "but not one that concerns me. Perhaps this missing woman simply chose not to return home, if such circumstances truly exist. People sometimes have very good reasons for leaving places they no longer wish to remain." Something dangerous flashed behind Margaret's eyes, at the pointed implication buried within Ivy's careful words, and for a brief moment, the pleasant mask slipped just enough to reveal the calculating cruelty beneath. "How very presumptuous of you to speak so confidently about circumstances you claim no knowledge of." "Lady Margaret," Draven interjected, his voice carrying a warning edge that made several nearby council members shift uncomfortably. "I would remind you that you are a guest within my territory. Extended courtesy on the assumption that your visit concerns legitimate diplomatic matters. If you have some grievance with my healer that predates this diplomatic mission, I would ask that you state it plainly, rather than continuing these veiled implications." Margaret studied him for a long moment, clearly recalculating her approach in the face of his unmistakable protectiveness toward Ivy. Finally, she offered another graceful bow, though the smile that followed carried a colder, more determined quality than before. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I meant no disrespect toward you or your household. Simply an old woman's foolish sentimentality, hoping to reconnect with someone I once cared for deeply." She paused, her eyes flicking back toward Ivy with unmistakable calculation. "Perhaps we might speak privately at some point during my visit, in case my memory truly is simply mistaken. I would hate to leave without at least attempting to resolve my confusion." The formal diplomatic proceedings continued through the remainder of that afternoon, though Ivy found it nearly impossible to concentrate on the trade discussions unfolding around her. Every fiber of her attention instead focused on tracking Margaret's movements throughout the Great Hall, watching for any sign of the woman's next move. She knew, with sick certainty, that Margaret had not traveled this enormous distance simply to satisfy idle curiosity about a former stepdaughter's fate. Something far more calculated was unfolding beneath the surface of this supposedly diplomatic visit. That evening, Draven found Ivy in her private quarters, her hands still trembling slightly despite her best efforts to project calm composure. "You know her," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "The way you spoke to her, the way you reacted, there's history between you that goes far deeper than simple mistaken identity." Ivy closed her eyes briefly beneath her veil, understanding that the time for continued evasion had finally, unavoidably, arrived. "Yes," she admitted. "I know her. She was my stepmother before I fled my family's estate several years ago." "And your face," Draven said carefully, his voice gentle despite the weight of the question. "Does she have something to do with why you've never once removed that veil in all the months I've known you?" Ivy felt tears prick unexpectedly behind her eyes, the accumulated weight of years spent hiding this particular truth, finally threatening to overwhelm her careful composure. "She cursed me," she said quietly, the words feeling strange after so long spent avoiding them entirely. "On the night of my 18th birthday, jealousy over my resemblance to my late mother, over some inheritance she felt threatened her own position within my father's household. She twisted my face into something monstrous, and warned me she would make certain no healer could ever undo it, if I ever revealed the truth to anyone." Draven crossed the room slowly, settling into the chair across from where she sat, his golden eyes never once leaving her veiled face throughout her painful confession. "That's why you fled. Why you've hidden yourself away in Thornwick. Why you've never once let anyone see beneath that veil. Not even me." "I was afraid," Ivy admitted. "Afraid of how people would react. Afraid you would look at me differently, treat me differently, once you understood the truth of what I actually look like beneath this cloth." "Ivy," Draven said, his voice carrying a quiet, steady conviction, that made her breath catch. "I have known you for nearly a year now. I have watched you save countless lives with your own 2 hands. Have watched you challenge my authority when you believed I was making a mistake. Have watched you offer genuine kindness to everyone within this fortress regardless of their standing or usefulness to you. None of that has anything to do with what your face looks like beneath that veil. None of it ever has." "You don't know what she did to me," Ivy said, her voice breaking slightly despite her efforts to maintain composure. "What I truly look like now. It's not simply a scar, Draven. It's monstrous, twisted beyond anything you could reasonably imagine." "Then show me," he said simply. "Let me see, and let me decide for myself whether it changes anything about how I feel toward you." The offer hung between them, terrifying in its simplicity, and Ivy found herself facing the very fear she had carried since that terrible night 3 years ago. The fear that revealing the truth would destroy whatever fragile, precious connection she had managed to build in this unexpected sanctuary she had found within Ashcrest's walls. But even as that fear gripped her, she also recognized something else settling alongside it. A quiet, stubborn hope that perhaps, finally, after years of hiding, she might find someone capable of looking past the curse to see the woman who had survived it. Slowly, with trembling hands, Ivy reached up toward the edge of her veil, prepared, for the first time since fleeing her family's estate, to reveal the truth Margaret's jealousy had carved into her once familiar face. But before her fingers could complete the motion, a sharp knock echoed against her chamber door, followed immediately by Helka's urgent voice, calling through the wood. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but you're needed immediately. There's been an incident in the eastern courtyard, and Lady Margaret's entourage is involved." Draven's expression shifted instantly from tender concern to sharp alertness, and Ivy quickly lowered her hands, the veil still firmly in place, the revelation postponed by whatever new crisis had suddenly erupted within the fortress walls. "This isn't finished," Draven said quietly, rising from his chair. "Whatever happens tonight, I still want to see you, Ivy, when you're ready. Not because I need convincing, but because I want you to finally be free of hiding, whenever you're prepared to embrace that freedom." He left to address the emerging crisis, and Ivy sat alone in her quarters for a long moment afterward, her heart still racing, uncertain whether the interruption represented a cruel twist of fate or a fortunate reprieve from a moment she had not yet been fully prepared to face. She did not know, in that suspended moment of uncertainty, that the incident in the eastern courtyard was merely the opening move in a far more dangerous confrontation Margaret had been carefully orchestrating since the very moment she arrived at Ashcrest's gates, a confrontation that would force the truth Ivy had guarded so carefully into the open far sooner, and far more publicly, than either she or Draven could have anticipated. Flames licked at the edge of the herb storage building before the guards managed to smother them, and by the time Ivy reached the eastern courtyard, following close behind Draven and a contingent of alarmed fortress guards, the acrid smell of smoke still hung heavy in the cold night air. "What happened here?" Draven demanded, his voice carrying sharp authority as he surveyed the scene. Guards restraining 2 of Margaret's southern attendants near the smoldering remains of a supply shed. These 2 were caught setting fire to the healer's storage building, one of the fortress guards reported, gesturing toward the restrained men. Claimed they were simply lighting a lantern that got away from them, but 3 witnesses saw them deliberately spreading oil along the wooden walls before striking the flame. Ivy's stomach twisted with cold understanding. That storage building held nearly a full year's worth of carefully gathered and prepared herbs, remedies she had spent countless hours preparing for the fortress's medical needs. The loss would have been devastating, though she suspected, with growing certainty, that destroying her supplies had never truly been the primary goal of whatever scheme Margaret had set into motion. "Where is Lady Margaret?" Draven asked, his golden eyes scanning the gathered crowd with barely contained fury. "I'm here, Your Majesty," Margaret's voice called out, and Ivy turned to see her stepmother approaching from across the courtyard, her expression carrying a carefully crafted mixture of concern and confusion that Ivy immediately recognized as pure theater. "I heard the commotion and rushed to see what had happened. I do hope none of my attendants are responsible for whatever chaos has occurred here. Your attendants were caught deliberately setting fire to my healer's supplies," Draven said, his voice cold with barely restrained anger. "I would ask you to explain their actions, Lady Margaret, before I decide how severely to respond to this violation of my hospitality." Margaret's expression shifted into practiced dismay, though Ivy, who had spent years learning to read every subtle nuance of her stepmother's false emotions, saw something else entirely lurking beneath the surface, a calculating satisfaction that made her blood run cold. "I am mortified, Your Majesty," Margaret said, her voice carrying just the right note of distress. "Truly, I had no knowledge of any such plan, though I confess, I do wonder if perhaps my men grew overzealous in attempting to satisfy my earlier curiosity about your healer's true identity." The implication hung heavy in the smoke-filled air, and Ivy understood immediately what Margaret was doing, using the chaos of this manufactured incident to draw attention back toward her original accusation, forcing the confrontation Ivy had been dreading into the open, before an audience of fortress nobility who had gathered to witness the unfolding drama. "Your curiosity does not grant your men license to commit arson within my territory," Draven said sharply. "Of course not, Your Majesty, and I apologize sincerely for whatever misguided actions they took in service of satisfying that curiosity." Margaret's pale gray eyes shifted toward Ivy, sharp and calculating despite the false remorse coloring her voice. "Though perhaps this unfortunate incident could still serve some good purpose, if your healer would simply confirm or deny my earlier suspicions, we might finally put this entire matter to rest, and I could offer whatever compensation you deem appropriate for the damage caused, before returning to my own territory, with whatever answers I came seeking." Every eye in the courtyard turned toward Ivy, the assembled crowd sensing, with the particular hunger for spectacle that seemed to accompany moments of significant tension, that something important was about to unfold. Ivy felt her heart pounding beneath her veil, understanding that Margaret had successfully cornered her into an impossible position. Refusing to answer would only confirm the suspicions Margaret had already planted, while any direct denial risked further scrutiny that might eventually uncover the truth regardless. "I have already told you," Ivy said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the trembling she felt building beneath the surface, "that you are mistaken about my identity." "Am I?" Margaret's voice carried a dangerous edge now, the careful pretense finally beginning to slip. "Then you won't mind proving it, will you? Remove your veil. Here, before all these witnesses, and put my foolish confusion to rest once and for all." "That is not a reasonable request," Draven interjected sharply, stepping protectively closer to Ivy's side. "My healer's private reasons for wearing that veil are her own business, not subject to public demand from a visiting noblewoman with clearly questionable motives." But Margaret was no longer content to be deflected, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking entirely, as whatever patience she had brought to this confrontation reached its breaking point. "Your Majesty, I understand your protectiveness towards someone who has clearly earned your trust and affection, but surely you deserve to know the truth about the woman you've allowed into your inner circle, into your very household. Surely, you deserve to know what she truly is, beneath whatever mask she's been hiding behind." Before anyone could stop her, before Draven or the fortress guards could react quickly enough to intervene, Margaret lunged forward with sudden, shocking speed, her hand closing around the edge of Ivy's veil and tearing it away in one violent motion. The courtyard fell into stunned, absolute silence. Ivy stood exposed before the assembled crowd, her ruined face fully visible in the flickering torchlight. The gray, cracked skin and uneven features that Margaret's curse had carved into her 3 years earlier, now displayed openly, for the first time since that terrible night. She could feel the horror and shock rippling through the gathered nobility, could see the way several attendants stepped back involuntarily, could hear the sharp intake of breath from more than one witness unprepared for what they were seeing. "There," Margaret said, her voice carrying a note of triumphant vindication despite the surrounding chaos. "There is the truth I came here to reveal. This creature standing before you, this thing wearing a healer's calm competence like a mask, is nothing more than my stepdaughter, cursed for her own arrogance and vanity, fled from her family's household rather than face the consequences of her actions." "That is a lie," Ivy said, her voice shaking now, though whether from fear or fury she could not entirely tell. "You cursed me out of your own jealousy, because I resembled my mother, because you could not bear to see any beauty exist in this world that wasn't your own. Believe whatever comforting story helps you sleep at night," Margaret snapped, her composure finally abandoned entirely. "The truth remains the same regardless. Look at her, Your Majesty. Look at what you've been keeping so close to your heart, so close to the seat of your power. Do you truly believe someone cursed for their own moral failings deserves such a position of trust and influence? The courtyard remained frozen in tense, horrified silence, every eye shifting between Ivy's exposed face and Draven's carefully controlled expression, waiting to see how their Alpha King would respond to this devastating public revelation. Ivy braced herself for rejection, for the same recoiling horror she had witnessed on every face turned toward her, certain that whatever fragile connection she had built with Draven over the past year could not possibly survive this brutal, public unveiling. But Draven did not step back. He did not recoil, did not turn away, did not offer any of the horrified reactions Margaret had clearly anticipated when she orchestrated this entire cruel spectacle. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Ivy, until he stood directly before her, his golden eyes fixed steadily on her exposed, twisted features, with an expression that held nothing but calm, unwavering conviction. "I see a woman who rode into a winter storm to save a stranger's life without hesitation," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "I see a woman who has spent every day since caring for the people within my territory, with genuine, selfless dedication. I see a woman whose honesty and integrity have never once wavered, regardless of what cruel magic was inflicted upon her against her will." He reached up slowly, gently cupping Ivy's ruined cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. "I do not see a monster, Margaret. I see the woman I have come to love, exactly as she is, curse or no curse." Gasps rippled through the assembled crowd at his declaration, and Margaret's expression twisted with fury and disbelief, her carefully orchestrated humiliation collapsing entirely in the face of Draven's unwavering acceptance. "You cannot mean that," Margaret said, her voice sharp with desperation. "Look at her. Truly look at what she has become. No amount of misguided affection changes the reality of that curse." "Perhaps not," Draven said, turning his gaze finally toward Margaret with an expression of cold, controlled fury. "But you should understand something about curses born of jealousy and hatred, Lady Margaret. They are rarely as permanent as the person casting them believes, and you have just made a very serious mistake, coming into my territory and attempting to weaponize my own affection against someone I have come to care for deeply." The air around them seemed to shift, a strange, charged energy building in the space between Draven and Ivy that neither of them fully understood in that moment, though Marta's old words about curses requiring unexpected conditions to break suddenly echoed in Ivy's memory with startling clarity. Something was happening, something neither Margaret's cruel magic nor Ivy's years of careful hiding had ever accounted for, and as Draven's hand remained gently cupped against her ruined cheek, his golden eyes never once wavering from her exposed face, despite the horrified murmurs still rippling through the watching crowd, Ivy felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth beginning to spread beneath her skin, as though the curse itself had finally encountered something it had never been designed to withstand. The warmth beneath Ivy's skin turned suddenly, sharply painful, and she gasped, stumbling back from Draven's touch as her ruined face began to burn with an intensity unlike anything she had experienced since the original curse first took hold 3 years earlier. "Ivy?" Draven's voice carried immediate alarm, his hands reaching out to steady her as her knees threatened to buckle beneath the sudden, overwhelming sensation. "Something's happening," Ivy managed to gasp, pressing her hands against her own burning face, uncertain whether she was witnessing the curse deepening its cruel hold, or something else entirely beginning to unfold. Margaret, watching from several feet away, let out a triumphant, cruel laugh. "Yes, something is happening indeed. Did you truly believe declarations of love could simply undo years of carefully woven dark magic? The curse is not so easily broken, Your Majesty. If anything, your foolish public declaration has likely angered whatever power still binds it, deepening its hold rather than releasing it." But even as Margaret spoke, something in her confident expression began to shift toward uncertainty, as the burning sensation across Ivy's face began visibly manifesting in ways that defied her prediction. The gray, cracked skin that had marked Ivy's ruined features for 3 long years began to shimmer and shift beneath the torchlight, the uneven texture smoothing gradually, the discoloration slowly fading toward something closer to her natural skin tone. "What's happening to her?" One of the Fortress Council members whispered from the edge of the crowd, disbelief evident in every word. Ivy could feel it now, unmistakably, the sensation of her own features slowly reshaping beneath her trembling fingers, the wrongness that had defined her face for 3 years, gradually easing into something that felt, impossibly, increasingly familiar. She kept her eyes closed throughout the transformation, too overwhelmed by the physical sensation and the surrounding chaos to fully process what was actually occurring, until finally, after several long, agonizing minutes, the burning sensation faded entirely, replaced by a strange, unfamiliar lightness. "Ivy," Draven said again, his voice carrying something between wonder and disbelief now. "Open your eyes, look at me." She opened her eyes slowly, uncertain what she would find, and found Draven staring at her, with an expression of stunned amazement, his golden eyes wide, with something that looked remarkably like joy, breaking through his earlier concern. "What do you see?" she whispered, almost afraid to ask. "I see you," he said simply. "Truly you. For the first time. Ivy. The curse. It's broken." Disbelieving, Ivy reached up to touch her own face, feeling smooth, familiar skin beneath her fingertips, where rough, uneven texture had existed only moments before. Someone nearby produced a small hand mirror, passed forward through the stunned crowd, and with trembling hands, Ivy finally looked at her own reflection for the first time in 3 long years. The face staring back at her was her own, truly her own, the same features she remembered from before that terrible night, though matured now by 3 years of hardship and growth, in ways that went beyond simple physical appearance. Her skin was smooth and clear once more, her eyes their familiar clear blue, her features restored to the natural beauty she had once carried, without ever fully appreciating it, before Margaret's jealousy had stolen it away. "How?" Ivy breathed, still staring at her own reflection in stunned disbelief. "How is this possible?" It was Marta's voice that answered, though the old healer had not been present moments before, having arrived at Ashcrest only that morning, at Draven's earlier request, drawn by messages describing the growing tension surrounding Margaret's visit. She pushed through the stunned crowd now, her sharp eyes studying the scene with immediate understanding. "I told you once, long ago, that curses born of jealousy require conditions the caster never expects," Marta said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "Jealousy curses are built upon a foundation of stolen worth, the caster believing they can transfer value from their victim to themselves, simply by destroying what they envy. But such curses have a fundamental weakness. They cannot withstand genuine, freely given love that asks nothing in return. Love that values the person beneath the curse rather than despite it." Her sharp eyes shifted toward Draven. "Your declaration, spoken with complete sincerity and witnessed by dozens of people, created exactly the condition required to shatter such dark magic entirely. You loved her, truly and completely, curse and all, without any hidden agenda or expectation. That kind of love is precisely what jealousy curses are powerless against." Margaret's face had gone pale with shock and fury, as she watched her carefully orchestrated humiliation collapse entirely into Ivy's unexpected triumph. "This is impossible," she hissed. "Years of careful magic, undone in mere moments by nothing more than sentiment?" "Not sentiment," Draven said, his voice carrying cold authority as he turned his full attention toward Margaret, one arm, now protectively wrapped around Ivy's shoulders. "Genuine love, Lady Margaret. Something your own jealous, hateful heart clearly never understood well enough to properly guard against. You spent years crafting a curse, designed to punish beauty you envied, never once considering that true worth exists far beyond simple physical appearance, and that anyone capable of recognizing that deeper worth would render your entire cruel scheme powerless." The fortress guards, sensing the shift in their Alpha King's demeanor, moved forward to properly restrain Margaret and her remaining attendants, no longer extending the diplomatic courtesy that had protected her position throughout the earlier confrontation. "You cannot simply imprison a visiting noblewoman," Margaret protested, though her earlier confidence had crumbled entirely into desperate fear. "There will be consequences, diplomatic repercussions from my territory." "There will indeed be consequences," Draven agreed, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Though I suspect they will fall considerably more heavily upon you than upon my territory. Once I send formal word to your husband's household, detailing the true nature of tonight's events, including the arson your attendants committed, and the dark curse magic, you've now openly confessed to practicing against your own stepdaughter. Such practices carry severe legal consequences, even in the southern provinces, if I recall correctly. Margaret's face drained of remaining color as the full weight of her exposed crimes finally settled over her, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that her jealousy-driven scheme had not only failed catastrophically, but had also left her entirely without protection or recourse, in a territory where the Alpha King's word carried absolute authority. Take her to the eastern holding chambers, Draven instructed the guards, along with her attendants. They'll remain there until I've determined appropriate consequences and arranged proper communication with the southern provinces regarding tonight's events. As the guards led Margaret away, her protests growing increasingly desperate and futile, Ivy found herself surrounded by the stunned but increasingly warm reactions of the fortress nobility, who had witnessed the entire extraordinary transformation. Whispered conversations rippled through the crowd, wonder and admiration replacing the earlier shock and horror that had greeted her initial unveiling. "I can hardly believe it," Ivy said quietly, still touching her own restored face with trembling fingers, scarcely able to process the sudden, overwhelming shift in her entire reality. 3 years, Draven. 3 years of hiding, of fear, and it's simply over. Not simply over, Draven said gently, turning her to face him fully, his golden eyes warm with an emotion that needed no further words to explain. Transformed into something new. You spent 3 years proving your own worth through your actions rather than your appearance, Ivy. That worth was never actually dependent on the curse's presence or absence. It was always yours, curse or no curse. Tonight simply revealed to everyone else what I already knew to be true, from the very first night I woke, to find you tending my wounds. Tears finally broke free, streaming down Ivy's restored face, though these tears carried none of the despair and fear that had marked so many nights during her years of hiding. These were tears of overwhelming relief, of joy so profound it nearly overwhelmed her entirely, of a future finally opening before her that she had scarcely dared to imagine possible. In the weeks that followed, word of the curse's dramatic breaking spread rapidly throughout both the northern territories and the southern provinces, carried by travelers and traders eager to share such an extraordinary story. Margaret was formally stripped of her noble title and sent back to face judgment within her own territory's legal system, her husband's family quick to distance themselves entirely from the scandal she had brought upon their household through her cruel, jealous actions. Ivy's father, upon receiving Draven's formal message detailing the truth of what had happened to his daughter years earlier, traveled personally to Ashcrest to see her, and their reunion, though initially strained by years of separation and unspoken guilt, gradually began healing wounds that had lingered since that terrible night 3 years earlier. He wept openly upon seeing his daughter's restored face, expressing regret for his own weakness in failing to protect her from Margaret's cruelty. And Ivy, though she could not entirely erase the pain of those difficult years, found herself able to offer forgiveness, understanding that his failures had come from weakness rather than genuine malice. The Pack Council, initially wary of their Alpha King's unconventional attachment to a former border healer with such an extraordinary and public history, gradually came to embrace Ivy's presence within their fortress, won over not by her restored beauty, but by the same qualities that had first drawn Draven's genuine affection, her steady competence, her fierce dedication to those under her care, her unwavering honesty, even when such honesty proved inconvenient or politically complicated. Lady Kareen's ambitions for securing Draven's mating quietly faded in the aftermath of such a public and dramatic demonstration of his genuine devotion to Ivy, and even she, in time, offered Ivy a grudging but genuine respect for having survived and ultimately triumphed over circumstances that would have destroyed a lesser person entirely. On a clear spring morning, nearly 1 year after that fateful night, when Margaret's cruelty had first been publicly exposed, and Ivy's curse had been broken by the power of genuine, freely given love, Draven and Ivy stood together before the assembled nobility of the northern packs, formalizing the mating bond that had already existed between them in every way that truly mattered since that transformative night in the fortress courtyard. Marta stood proudly among the witnesses, having accepted Draven's invitation to relocate permanently to Ashcrest, continuing to train Ivy in the deeper healing arts while also mentoring several younger apprentices, eager to learn from the legendary healer who had once saved an Alpha King's life, and, in the process, discovered the true power of love, strong enough to shatter even the cruelest curse. Ivy's father stood among the witnesses as well, his relationship with his daughter gradually rebuilding into something genuine and warm, though forever marked by the painful years they had lost to Margaret's jealousy and his own weakness. As Draven took Ivy's hands in his before the assembled crowd, completing the ceremonial bond that would formally unite them as mates and rulers of the Northern Territories together, Ivy found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From a terrified girl fleeing her family's estate in the dead of night, hiding a curse-ravaged face behind her mother's old veil, to a respected healer who had earned her place through skill and dedication rather than inherited privilege, to finally standing here, restored and beloved, about to become queen of a territory that had once been nothing more than a distant, mysterious rumor in her old life. 3 years ago, Draven said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, I was a wounded stranger, saved by a healer, who asked nothing in return except the chance to help. I did not know, in that moment, that I was also being saved in ways far deeper than simple physical healing, saved from a lifetime of isolation and calculated relationships by a woman brave enough to offer genuine honesty and care, without any expectation of reward. And I, Ivy said, her voice equally steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her, spent 3 years believing my worth had been stolen from me, believing I would spend the remainder of my life hiding behind a veil, grateful simply to survive, rather than truly live. I did not know that the very act of surviving with honesty and integrity intact would eventually prove more powerful than any cursed jealousy could ever craft. As their bond was formally sealed before the cheering crowd of Northern Pack nobility, the setting sun painting the sky above Ashcrest in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Ivy understood, with complete and unwavering certainty, that whatever cruel intentions Margaret had once carried into that candlelit room 3 years earlier had ultimately given way to something far more powerful than any curse could ever hope to be. She had not simply survived her stepmother's jealousy, she had transformed its cruel intentions into an unexpected path toward genuine love, hard-won respect, and a future brighter than anything she could have imagined on that terrifying night when the fire of dark magic first swept across her skin. The curse that had once seemed like the ending of everything she valued had instead become the beginning of a story far greater than she ever could have written for herself. Proof that even the darkest jealousy, however powerful it might seem in the moment, could never truly extinguish the light of a heart determined to find its own worth, its own strength, and ultimately, its own well-earned happiness.